Hello everyone, it's Scott and we're back for day 10 of Aetherdrift preview season. So we got almost all the remaining cards today, so we got an interesting group of cards to look at. But before we dive into those previews, remember to like and subscribe to get further content like this throughout Aetherdrift preview season and beyond. And if you're looking for cards from Aetherdrift or Innistrad Remastered, you can check us out on the web at caffeinatedgamers.tcgplayerpro.com. And I'll also be coming out with some top 10 lists in the coming days, so stay tuned for those. I'll be looking at the mythic rares, the rares, and then uncommons, do at least a top 10 list, and possibly some commons as well. Let's dive into today's previews. So first we got our final Gearhulk. Coalheart Gearhulk for 1, 2 black, and 2 red mana. You get an artifact creature, that's a construct. It's a 5/4. It also has Death Touch and Menace. And when this creature enters the battlefield, put target creature card with mana value 4 or less from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control with a finality counter on it. It gains Menace, Death Touch, and Haste. Exile that creature at the beginning of your next end step. So very powerful enter the battlefield ability where you get to take really the best 4 or less mana card from a graveyard and then give it Haste, Death Touch, and Menace. So I like that ability on it, but I'm not sure that it has a deck right now to go in Standard. Certainly it looks like a black-red vehicles deck might be something that we see in Standard, so maybe that's the home for this. But I think no matter what, this is a good Magic card. It will get played. Now, is this a 4 of index? Probably not, but I can see a couple copies of it as the top end of a curve, and because of that ability to go ahead and get a creature back as well when you play it, I think that's enough to make this definitely Standard playable. Now the question is, do we have a Rakdos deck that this is going to easily fit into in Standard? Well, probably not right now, but we do have some other things that we do have in Standard that I think will make this attractive to players. Certainly the Demon package, if you're going mono black, maybe now you splash in some red and you get this Gearhulk and you can get out of your graveyard, whatever demon you need to. And when you do that, you're going to be able to hit your opponent for a decent amount of damage on that turn because all of the demons basically have flying. So I think that's going to make this good enough to see Standard play. Next, we've got Hollow Squad Heavy for 2 and a red mana. You get a Goblin Mercenary, that's a 2/3 with Start Your Engine. And other goblins you control have haste, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, create a 1/1 red goblin creature token. That token attacks this turn if able, and it has max speed of tap it to add 1 red mana for each goblin you control. So this is a very, very powerful card, and I think it might be enough to make goblins playable in Standard. We already have a couple of lords in red that are goblins, plus we also have Krenko Mob Boss back in the format, so we've got a lot of really good cards that have abilities on them that Hallowed Squad Heavy really helps because he can give all those cards haste. So you play Krenko with Hallowed Squad Heavy on the field, and then you get to activate Krenko's ability where it's going to create goblins equal to the number of goblins you have. So I think this is the card that may be the glue that brings a true goblin deck together in Standard. Next, we've got lower rarity cards for the day because we only had 2 rares that we saw today, or the 1 rare and the 1 mythic today. So let's talk about the lower rarity stuff that we saw. So first is Alacrinan Armory for 3 and a white mana. You get an artifact, and creatures you control get +0/+1 and have vigilance. And at the beginning of combat on your turn, choose up to 1 target mount or vehicle you control until end of turn. That permanent becomes saddled if it's a mount, and becomes an artifact creature if it's a vehicle. So interesting ability on this. It's kind of a static way, if you don't have creatures, to make sure that your mounts are saddled and your vehicles are crewed. So I like that about the card. And the fact that it gives vigilance as well. I think, if we do have a deck in white that is going to have artifact vehicles in it, then I think this is a card that you might want to consider as a kind of not necessarily top end card, but a card that's going to guarantee that if your opponent wipes out all your creatures, you're still going to be able to attack with your vehicles. And for that reason, I like the card because it kind of gives a safety net for all those vehicles that otherwise you couldn't crew if you didn't have something to crew them. Next, we've got Rover Blades for 3 mana. You get an artifact that's an equipment vehicle. It's a 2/2 with double strike. An equipped creature has double strike, and you can equip it for 4 mana, or you can crew it for 2, and you get a 2/2 with double strike. So I think the flexibility on this, I think, is interesting. Now, 7 total mana to give a creature double strike probably is too much in standard, but I think in limited, it's a good way to make sure that if you've got a creature with trample, that some trample damage is going to get through because of its double strike ability. So I think there's playability in limited. I don't know if it's going to have any standard play at all. Next, we've got Push the Limits for 5 and 2 red mana. You get a sorcery and return all mount and vehicle cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. Sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step. Vehicles you control become artifact creatures until end of turn. Creatures you control gain haste until end of turn. So basically, for 7 mana, you get to pull all the mounts, all the vehicles out of your graveyard, replay them, and attack for hopefully one final swing to win the game. So it's kind of a chancy card in some ways. It's kind of, an against the odds card, I guess is kind of a way to put it, where I don't think this is probably going to see standard play because it's 7 mana. But if you have a way to ramp into this and you've got vehicles and mounts that you're using, and over the course of the game a number of them die, then this is a great way to bring those back from the graveyard, get one more attack in with all of them, and hopefully do enough damage to win the game. But overall, I don't see it as a card that we're going to probably see in standard. Limited, if you got a mount and vehicle deck, then I think it's a card I would definitely want to consider in my deck. Next, we have Outpace Oblivion for 2 and a red mana. You get an enchantment with Start Your Engine, and when this enchantment enters the battlefield, it deals 5 damage to up to 1 target creature or planeswalker, and that's nice. You get flexibility there. And you can sacrifice it for 2 mana, and it deals 2 damage to each player who doesn't have max speed. So really kind of a nice enter the battlefield ability where it does 5 damage to a target creature or planeswalker. And we already have the bounce deck in standard. So I'm wondering if cards like this might fit into a strategy like that. So maybe instead of it being Esper, you throw in red as a way to get more damage to creatures your opponent might control. But outside of that, I'm not sure if it's going to be good enough to see any standard play on its own, unless you really value that Start Your Engine ability, where you're going to go ahead and use this on turn 3, start your engine, maybe you've started it already, and then you take advantage of it from there. Next, we've got Locust Spray for a black mana. You get an instant. Your creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn, and you can cycle it for a black mana. So I kind of see this as almost a spell that probably isn't going to see standard play. It's decent and limited. Now, the fact that it does have that cycle ability on it, I think might give it some standard playability in the right build, because this is a way to get rid of it because you're not going to be able to use it, and you can still get value out of it because you'll be able to cycle it and draw a different card for that. Because sometimes you're going to run into decks that simply aren't playing any creatures, or the creatures they are playing are too tall for the ability to have any real effect in the game. So then you just cycle it away, get a different card to play. Next, we have our first reprint of the day, and this is Spell Pierce. It's a counter spell against any non-creature spell, unless its controller pays 2 mana for 1. Great card that historically has seen a lot of play over the years, so I would expect it to see play again. Next, we've got some additional commons from the day. And the first is Light Wheel Enhancements. For a white mana, you get an aura, and you can enchant a creature or a vehicle. It gets Start Your Engine. An enchanted permanent gets +1/+1 and has Vigilance. And at max speed, you may cast this card from your graveyard. So I like the flexibility on this. You know, it may be something that would work in the Boros Enchantments deck because it's 1 mana. You get a +1/+1. You give that creature Vigilance. But more importantly, you know, you'll be able to play this from your graveyard if you get to max speed, because you know a lot of times, you know, creatures that have auras on the creature dies, all the auras go away. Well, this is a way to get that aura back. So I could see some standard playability for this card. Next, we have Grim Bauble for a black mana, and when this artifact enters the battlefield, target creature an opponent controls gets -2/-2 until end of turn. And for 2 and a black mana, you can sacrifice this artifact to Surveil 2. So again, this is another one of those cards that probably sees some standard play, because 1 mana gives something -2/-2 is nice. And the fact that it's a permanent is helpful. And then you can, at some point, either bounce it back to your hand to do it again, or you can sacrifice it to Surveil 2 and get some value that way. Next, we've got Deathless Pilot for 1 and a black mana. It's a zombie pilot, and it's a 2/2. This creature saddles, mounts, and crews vehicle as though its power were 2 greater. And for 3 and a black mana, you can return this card from your graveyard to your hand. So again, good limited card. Probably won't see standard play unless there's a vehicle deck that would be able to take advantage of that extra ability to crew something that requires a crew value of 4. Next, we've got lower rarity red cards for the day, and the first is Crash and Burn for 3 and a red mana. You get an instant where you can either destroy target vehicle, or Crash and Burn deals 6 damage to target creature or planeswalker. So a limited card, I think, is only place we're going to see this, because we've got a Braid for 2 mana that does 3 damage or kills an artifact, so it's more broad in its approach. But I think in limited, definitely a card I would put in my deck. Next, we've got Lightning Strike, which is our second reprint of the day. So Lightning Strike, it will be in standard for the next 3 years. It's a card that sees quite a bit of play in red decks because of that ability to either shoot a creature, a planeswalker, or do direct damage to your opponent. So we're going to see this, continue to see a lot of play in standard. And our final red card of the day is Kick-Off Celebrations for 1 and a red mana. You get an enchantment with Start Your Engines, and when this enchantment enters the battlefield, you may discard a card. If you do, draw 2 cards, and if you reach max speed, you can sacrifice the enchantment, and creatures and vehicles you control gain haste until end of turn. So this is another one of those cards that has a nice ability on it, and if you can blink it, and this is where we're talking about earlier with a couple of cards from that were in white and black. And I like that ability to blink something like this, get the value a couple of times, getting those extra cards, getting rid of something you either want to get in the graveyard, and again, giving you something that will be a bounce target is also a nice ability. Next, we've got Pothole Mole for 2 and a green mana. You get a mole, and when this creature enters the battlefield, mill 3 cards, then you may return a land card from your graveyard to your hand. It's a 2/3. Again, this is a limited card at best. Alright, and our last card of the day is Howler's Heavy for 3 and a blue mana. You get a Seal Pirate. That's a 3/4. It has cycling for 1 and a blue mana. And when you cycle this card, target creature or vehicle an opponent controls gets -3/-3 until end of turn. So I think this is a limited card that definitely would be playable. It's a 3/4 body, okay, which is fine and limited. But that ability when you cycle it, so you're going to get a card for your 2 mana, and something that your opponent plays is going to lose 3 power, which I think is good enough for limited. All right, those were day 10's previews from Aetherdrift. We'll get the last cards tomorrow, so we'll be back for one more preview video, and then we'll be going into our top 10 list of the 10 to 15 cards I think are going to have the most impact in Standard that are rare, mythic, and uncommon. And if we get enough uncommons in there, I'll go ahead and do a video for those as well. But thanks for staying to the end of the video, and I will see you in the next one.